Good afternoon, attendees of this colloquium. I am Abigail Payne, the Ronald Henderson Professor and Director of the Melbourne Institute, Applied Economic and Social Research in the Faculty of Business and Economics. Let me extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you. Let me also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. We initiated these colloquia last year when we were in lockdown and were not permitted to offer face-to-face events and workshops. While we are looking forward to a period when we can return to face-to-face events, we have also recognized the importance of our being able to connect with you using online technologies such as Zoom. Our virtual colloquia are an opportunity for us to present our current analyses and to engage in a policy discussion on issues of importance to Australia. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jan Kabatek. Jan is a research fellow in the Institute. His work has covered a range of issues that involves topics such as households, education, and employment. His presentation today will address work he has been undertaking to better understand academic achievement by children of same-sex parents. While you may think that this should not be an issue, recent opinion polls suggest that half of Australians believe there is a difference in the quality of parenting between same-sex and different-sex couples. Jan will speak for approximately 20 to 25 minutes. This will be followed by discussion through your comments and questions. Before I turn the colloquium over to Jan, let me remind you of a few housekeeping matters. This colloquium is being recorded. To handle questions and comments, we are relying on the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen for those of you using Zoom. For those of you using Slido, you can submit the questions in the box on the right-hand side of your screen. You can submit questions at any time through these functions. And now, let me turn this colloquium over to Jan. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you so much, Abigail, for the introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming. This is a great pleasure, and I'm very excited to be here. So let me just start the slides. Excellent. I hope that you can see the content now. So I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This presentation will be revolving quite heavily around a study that I wrote together with Francisco Perales, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Queensland. We managed to publish this study earlier this year in a journal called Demography, which is the premier outlet for same-sex research, and we are very grateful for this recognition. In fact, I would very much encourage you to read the full study because there's a lot of material which I won't be able to cover during this presentation. And we will actually link you the study in an email that will follow the colloquium. So there's that. Okay, so sorry, I can't move into the slides because let me start this presentation by casting your minds back to the year 2017, which was the year of the Australian Postal Survey. The survey asked a very simple question, and that is whether the law should be changed to allow same-sex couples to marry. As I'm sure you're aware, the outcome of this survey was positive. The majority of respondents said yes, the law should be changed. And indeed, after the survey, the legislation was introduced to allow same-sex couples to marry for the first time in Australia. Now, there were also other things which were revealed by this survey, specifically that same-sex relationships remain a very controversial topic of the public debate. And this is very much exemplified by almost 40% of respondents who expressed the disagreement with this statement. They didn't want the law to change. So same-sex marriage was controversial and still is. But there are other same-sex topics which are even more controversial. And on the top of the list is often same-sex parenthood and same-sex parenting. Just to illustrate this, I'm showing you a figure which comes from another survey that has been collected after the Postal survey in 2018. And this survey asked a representative group of Australians the question whether they agree with the statement that same-sex couples are as good parents as other presumably different-sex couples. And the responses were basically 50-50. Right? You can see that the majority agreed with the statement, but the majority was only 54.5% strong. So this just goes to show that the topic of same-sex parenting is still polarizing and still very much open to debate. Now, these debates got quite heated around the time of the Postal survey, as you might remember. There were a lot of debates, and unfortunately, many of the arguments used in these debates were based on hearsay and personal beliefs rather than strong objective facts. And this is obviously not the best conducive platform which could change people's opinions and beliefs. Now, there are groups which were trying to inform the debate, especially when it comes to academic research. The best example of this is the article which appeared in the Medical Journal of Australia, which essentially concluded that same-sex parenting does not harm children. There is no disadvantage imposed by same-sex parenting on their children, but the discrimination of same-sex couples and same-sex couples might bring some adverse effects. And during the time of the survey, I read these articles with great interest because personally, I also didn't know too much about the state of the academic literature when it came to same-sex parenting and children in these families. So I learned that there is basically a consensus which is in line with the title of this article. But I also learned that many of the studies of same-sex parenting are actually suffering from rather substantive shortcomings. And these shortcomings open them up to criticism, which is often quite justified. And this is obviously a problem. So just what I mean by this, well, let's say that the study of same-sex relationships suffers from the very same problems as any empirical domain of scientific inquiry, which focuses on small groups within a large population. And that is that either you will be analyzing very small samples of families, but you will have a lot of information about them, or you will have large samples of families, but you will have very little information, very little that you could say about their characteristics and also about the outcomes of their children. So in the context of same-sex studies, the first category of studies were much more common before 2010. These were kind of the initial stages of the research, and they were really important. However, with these small and non-representative samples, many people were asking questions whether the results can be extrapolated to broader same-sex populations. And of course, these questions are justified. So after 2010, the state of the art in this domain of research moved to large data sets, specifically American census data. The census data was good because it included large samples of same-sex families. However, the information was limited. Two particular problems were that the data didn't really contain any family histories. You just saw a snapshot of the family at the time of collecting the census, but you didn't really know what happened before the census. The other problem was that the outcome measures for children were rather severely limited. In fact, the only reliable measure of educational achievement was the so-called grade retention, which is a measure that quantifies whether or not a specific child has repeated a grade during their educational progress. And as you can imagine, this is not the greatest measure of educational outcomes. It essentially ignores a lot of interesting variation, especially among higher achieving children. So that was the state of the literature when we approached this topic for the first time. And I quickly realized that we can do much better than what has been done so far if we leverage the Dutch administrative data. Now, this is a great resource which links multiple registers of government-based information, which granted us unprecedented flexibility. Basically, we had the data of the entire population. We could identify all families and all different family types, and we had very precise outcome measures for their children. And with this data, we conducted the first large-scale study which documented a same-sex advantage in academic achievement. Just coming back to the last slide, these American studies actually documented two results. Either they show that there is no advantage of same-sex parented families, meaning that the two family types are the same, or they show that there is a slight disadvantage corresponding to same-sex families. And there is quite a heated academic debate about which one is it. So our study very much differed from this in terms of documenting the advantage of same-sex families. But before I start talking about the study, I should also tell you about the institutional context, because the Netherlands is a rather specific country. You might be aware that the Netherlands has been very much on the forefront of same-sex rights advancements for many, many years. In fact, most of the legislation which was aimed at same-sex couples was introduced in the Netherlands among the first countries in the world. And that goes for registered partnerships, that goes for same-sex marriage, and all the other legislative pieces. Now here I'm comparing the years of introduction to similar years of introduction in Australia, although I should say that it's a little bit tricky to make this comparison because most of these legislations were introduced on the state level in Australia, so there's quite a lot of variation in terms of the years of introduction. But regardless of that, essentially the picture is that the Netherlands can be considered one of the best case scenarios when it comes to inclusion of sexual minorities. And that goes for legislation, but it also goes for attitudes, because the Dutch always rank high on all kinds of same-sex inclusion indices. So that's something to be borne in mind when interpreting our results. Now, the data comes from the National Statistical Office, and as I said, it combines multiple registers containing precise information about the population. This data allows us to identify all family types, the different sex-parented families, same-sex parented families, and also others. It also allows us to see very precise measures of educational outcomes. Specifically, we do observe children's test scores, but we also see other educational achievement, which we will analyze as well in the study. Now, in terms of the sample that we analyze, essentially in this whole universe of data, we focus on children who have taken the standardized test between the years 2006 and 2017. And this has got a very prosaic reason, because that is the period during which we observe the test scores in the data. The test itself is a finishing test taken in a primary school, and it's very important because it essentially guides students in terms of their high school track choice. It will advise students which track to choose, and everybody takes this test very seriously. So among all these children who took the test in between these years, we isolate the children who were living with two parents at the time of the test. And in this sample, we distinguished the same-sex and different-sex parented children. Now we look at the composition of the household at the time of the test, because as I will show you in a few slides, many children will enter same-sex parented families only later on in their lives. And this is very important to take into account. So this sample selection yields a very robust data set of 1.4 million children in different sex parented families and approximately 3,000 children in same-sex parented families. So again, you can clearly see that this is a small group within the full population. What you can also see is that this group is predominantly parented by two female parents. The sample of children with male same-sex parents is very small, which just goes to show how much more difficult it is to become a parent if you are a male same-sex couple. Okay, next I would like to show you some descriptive statistics, which are comparing the families with different sex parents and families with same-sex parents. First thing which I'll show you are the children's test scores. Already here you can see that the children in same-sex parented families are doing better on average than the children in different sex parented families. Their test scores are higher in terms of their percentile ranks, but even if we looked at raw test scores, there would be a same-sex advantage. Interestingly enough, this advantage holds in all the subjects that were tested, including language, mathematics, and also general study skills. Further, we can see that the same-sex parents themselves are much less likely to be married compared to different sex parents. They're less likely to be first-generation immigrants, and they also have fewer children in their household, which probably is not that surprising. What might also not be surprising is that the same-sex parents are more educated. They're much more likely to be college educated, as you can see from this comparison. And perhaps interestingly, this doesn't really reflect in terms of their employment. Both groups of parents are similarly likely to be employed. The most interesting in this category is parental income, which is actually lower among same-sex parents. And that might be a little bit counterintuitive, but it's something that we found and other studies have found as well. Right. Now, the most interesting comparison pertains to the domain of family dynamics, in which we show that the vast majority of children with different sex parents live in very intact and stable families. In fact, 90% of these children are living with their birth parents, meaning that they haven't experienced any family instability throughout their first 11 years of life. In contrast, in the same-sex category, this corresponds only to 44% of children, which means the majority of children that live with same-sex parents have experienced some sort of marital or family instability. And in fact, the majority of children have actually experienced the breakdown of their birth family, which is usually a different sex family. And this breakdown was followed by the repartnering of the mother with a female spouse. So this is very important, and it's something that we should really take into account when we are comparing the outcomes of children. Perhaps reflecting this, we also see that the children in same-sex parented families are more likely to experience a residential move. They change addresses during the first 11 years of their life, and we also account for them. All right. So now we see that the two groups of families are very different from each other. And we would like to conduct a statistical analysis which accounts for all these differences. Specifically, we would like to extract the same-sex parenting advantage, which cannot be attributed to any of these controls. And that's what we do. So we estimate a few regression models, which allow us to do that. And we extract the same-sex parenting advantages in multiple models. We start with the model which doesn't control for any of the parental characteristics, and then we add more and more controls, and we look at how the same-sex parentage changes, same-sex parenting advantage changes when you add demographics, education and income controls, and also finally family dynamics. Okay. So the results of this analysis can be shown in a figure. What I'm showing you here is same-sex advantage, which is specified in terms of standard deviation of children's test scores. And the first bar corresponds to the simplest model, which doesn't control for any characteristics of these families whatsoever. So the first bar essentially shows that there is a positive advantage, positive same-sex advantage, which is statistically significant. And now we can move to the model which also accounts for demographic controls, such as immigration, ethnic background, age, and other characteristics. And as you can see, if we account for these differences, the advantage doesn't really change. It's basically the same. So then we move to the next model in which we control for education and income. And now you should remember that the same-sex parents are more likely to be highly educated. So if we account for this, then the same-sex advantage actually drops. And it drops to about 50% of the association, which we've seen before. That's quite a profound drop. Now, if we then extend the model to also account for the family dynamics and the general instability of families, then the same-sex advantage shoots right back up, and it attains magnitude which is almost the same as the magnitude of the unconditional model. And this last bar is the estimate which we are favoring. This is our principal estimate of same-sex advantage. Now, you might be wondering, what does this estimate actually represent? Whether this is a big or a small advantage. And I have to admit that it's really hard to express these advantages in some digestible fashion. So in order to do that, let me abstract from this figure. And let's imagine that you have a class of 25 students, and you will rank these 25 students by their abilities. So in this context, the same-sex advantage would essentially mean that the child with same-sex parents would rank one place higher than a child with different sex parents, who is otherwise completely identical in terms of the family characteristics. So the same-sex advantage would essentially mean that you are going one place up in the ranking of these 25 students. And that's probably the best case scenario of trying to interpret the magnitude of these effects. Now, is this a large effect? Not really. But is it small? Well, especially in the context of education literature, it would definitely not be considered small. In fact, if you would have a policy which results in such an advantage, that would be a very, very, very successful policy. So it's definitely not something to be trifled at, and we shouldn't dismiss this advantage just on the basis that it's not that large. Okay, now we also explore the heterogeneity of these results. We essentially show that the same advantage manifests for both boys and girls. It manifests in all the domains that are tested, and it seems to be slightly greater for families with female same-sex parents. We also experiment a lot with the specification of the model just to make sure that the results are not sensitive to our modeling and sample selection choices. Unfortunately, they're not. We see these results manifesting across the board, which is really great. We also look at later life outcomes, looking at specific measures of educational achievement. And also in this case, we see same-sex advantage. We see same-sex advantage in terms of the high school track choice. The same-sex parent children are more likely to enter academic tracks, which would prepare them for university education. They're also more likely to graduate from high school, and they're also more likely to enroll into college. And these effects are quite substantive. The only outcome for which we do not see a significant effect is grade retention, which is the measure that has been used by the US studies. And that's quite interesting. I mean, the association goes in the right direction. There is less grade retention among same-sex parented families, but it is not statistically significant, which perhaps suggests that this is not the best measure of educational outcome. Right, so now we have established that same-sex advantage exists in the Dutch data. And now we can start asking the interesting questions. First of all, we can ask what drives the better outcomes of these children. And before I answer this question, I should make a disclaimer and say that the findings I have shown you and all the findings in our paper are not causal. This is very important. Essentially, you can't just take a child and put it into a same-sex family and expect that this child will develop the educational advantage that we see in the data. We very much acknowledge that there is strong selection into parenthood among same-sex couples, and this selection distorts the causal interpretation of our results. The best we can do is essentially state that in the sample that we have, the children with same-sex parents are doing better relative to children with different sex parents and similar characteristics. But still, we can ask why this is the case. And there are a few mechanisms which can be discussed. So first of all, same-sex couples tend to face much more substantive barriers to parenthood than different-sex couples. These are institutional barriers, political barriers, but also just practical barriers. And overcoming these barriers can strengthen their commitment to their roles as parents. And of course, this can also turn into positive parenting practices. And in the end, it might improve the educational achievement. The other thing is that same-sex parents can be also facing more social and community pressures to perform and be as good parents as they can be. And the last point which I wanted to say is that the choice to become parent is very much a conscious choice for same-sex couples. There is no unintended pregnancy, which means that once again, these couples will be more committed to their parental roles, and this will foster educational achievement. The second question which you might be asking is whether or why do our findings differ from the findings of the big US studies? And I have a few things to say about this. So first of all, the big US studies do not control for family dynamics. They do not account for family instability because they do not see it in the data. And we argue that this puts the same-sex parented children in an unfair disadvantage. So that might be one of the reasons. The second reason is that the US data is not that good. It's actually rife with coding errors, which casts a lot of doubts about the findings that have been shown in these studies. Further, the Great Retention is just not a great measure of educational outcomes. And last but not least, American public is much more conservative than the Dutch, especially when it comes to same-sex parents. So it might well be the case that the same-sex families in the United States are subject to more stigma, and this stigma will lower the educational success of children in these families. Okay. So with all this information in mind, we still should ask whether it's a good idea to run with our results and extrapolate them to the Australian context. And I have to say that I do not have a good answer to this question. I'm a little bit skittish to do that. And let me tell you why. So first of all, let's return to the question which I showed you on the third slide, which is whether you consider same-sex couples as good parents as other couples. So if you look at the international comparison of responses to these questions, and if you rank the positive responses, we can see that the Netherlands is very much on the top of the list, always ranking high. In contrast, Australia is in the middle of the pack, being very close to the United States. So it's probably not that crazy to assume that Australian same-sex families will be subject to more stigma than the Dutch same-sex families. And this could potentially lower the same-sex advantage in the Australian context. On the other hand, there are other forces which will counteract this stigma. And one thing which I want to mention is that the Australian legislative system is much less developed in terms of same-sex rights and same-sex legislation in general. In fact, if you want to become a parent as a same-sex couple in Australia, you have to jump through more hoops in order to do so. The biggest problem in my eyes is that Medicare does not cover same-sex IVF treatments, which creates substantive costs for same-sex couples in Australia. And of course, not many people will be able to afford becoming parents. Similar issues arise with surrogacy. I mean, commercial surrogacy is banned, but that's not that uncommon. Almost all countries around the world, developed world, ban it. But even if you go for international commercial surrogacy, you can be, in principle, prosecuted in some states, especially in Queensland. So that puts the male same-sex couples in a fundamental disadvantage and leave them with very few options for becoming parents. And given that this legislative framework is much less developed, it might be the case that the Australian same-sex parents will be even more committed to their parenting roles because they have they had to jump through so many more hoops in order to become parents. And that could potentially counteract the greater stigma, and it could result in greater same-sex advantage in Australia, even though the reason for this advantage is not that great, as you can imagine. So basically, I'm rather skittish to make these extrapolations. I think that it's much more appropriate to analyze Australian data to look at the same-sex advantage or disadvantage that we might be facing. And in this context, there is a silver lining on the horizon, because if you are aware of the ABS MEDIT project, you're probably aware that the administrative linkages are becoming more and more powerful in Australia. And soon we will be able to replicate our study in Australian context. And that will be really interesting, because then we won't need to extrapolate anything. So despite my skittishness, I still feel that my results are extremely important, especially because we are analyzing what I labeled the best case scenario, right? So essentially we are portraying a viable picture of what could happen in other countries if these countries directed comparable resources and efforts towards the inclusion of same-sex minorities. In fact, we show that being raised by same-sex parents is not associated with any fundamental disadvantage. And if you are growing up in an environment which is positive and inclusive, both in terms of politics and also social attitudes, you are going to do really well. In fact, we think that in these environments, the children in same-sex parent families are definitely going to thrive. And with this, let me end, and thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you, Jan. So we have a number of questions that have come in, and the sets of questions we have are kind of twofold. One is going to be a set of questions that are more around your estimates and some of the statistical properties. And then we have some other questions that are broader based. Again, for those of you who are attending, if you have questions, please let me remind you that you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you're on Zoom, or the right-hand side if you're on Slido. So let's first talk about some of the more statistical oriented questions. So first question is, in the main regression analysis, the observation was made that the coefficient on educational attainment is only slightly larger than when you don't control for factors than when you start to bring in controls. And so the question is, when you look at your preferred estimates, how would you describe the importance or the value of adding in these additional controls?
That's a great question. And as you can imagine, some controls are more important than others. We have identified two groups of controls which are extremely important, and that is parental education and family stability. So parental education draws the same-sex advantage down, because children of more educated parents are likely to perform better than children of less educated parents. And controlling for the family instability is pushing the coefficient upwards, because it basically accounts for the fact that many of these children were subject to rather complicated family histories before they entered the same-sex family. And indeed, again, this is something that we should be really taking into account.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question. There's actually two kind of questions I'm going to bring together. So, you know, recognition that there is a remarkable, you have this amazing data set with lots of observations, but we'd like to know what is the fewest number of observations in your data that would allow to have similar significant effects. And tied into this is given the sample on children from same-sex periods is on the low side, how confident are you on your estimates?
Great question, great question. There is a big debate about this in the scientific literature. And I'm not an expert on the power, on statistical power, but the experts say that you should have at least 1,000 families or 1,000 observations to make educated and plausible estimates of their disadvantage or advantage. So that's the best I can say. And that's also why I'm slightly uncomfortable with comparing female same-sex parents and male same-sex parents, because in the male subgroup, we just have very few, just a little bit more than 100.
Okay, great. Now let's talk about some questions that may or may not be fair because you may not have had a chance to look at this.
Okay.
So one of the things is that in your paper, you focus a lot on educational outcomes. Have you been able to start looking at other types of economic, health, well-being types of measures to discern whether or not there are differences?
Good question. We haven't done that so far, although the data is there and we can potentially expand the analysis in these directions. There's already one study which does that with, I believe it's Swedish data, and they look at early life health outcomes. And they do not see any difference between children born to same-sex and different-sex parented families. Now, the psychological measures will be also very interesting to analyze. We haven't done anything along these lines yet, but it's definitely on our radar.
Okay, great. And then so your study is focused on two-parent families. Have you looked at single-parent families? Tied into this, have you looked at families in which the child has been adopted? Are there other kind of family types you've been able to look at?
Yes, we do that. In one of our robustness checks, we extend the analysis to single-parented families. As you can imagine, there is a disadvantage associated with growing up in a single-parented family, which is quite substantive. We also looked at adopted parents, and we tried to, or adopted children, and tried to look at the comparison of different sex and same-sex parented adoptive children. Unfortunately, there was not enough observations in our sample. Most of these people are either having biological children or they have children which come from the previous relationship.
Okay, great. And in terms of trying to discern why you're finding even a statistical difference, because I guess my assumption would be that there'd be no difference, have you been able to explore whether or not there are differences in characteristics you can observe? So, you cannot necessarily observe parenting style, but you might be able to observe, things like time spent in the home or the use of daycare or other characteristics that might help to pull apart why you're observing a difference.
We would love to do that. And it's a good insight that we might be able to use formal childcare use because that one is in the data. The time spent at home, that's much more tricky because, in principle, we do have only employment numbers essentially. So we would have to approximate the time spent at home very roughly. But it can be done with different data sets, potentially surveys, and I'm actually confident that there are many studies that do that. Unfortunately, yeah, it's a little bit out of the realm of the possibilities with admin data.
Okay, great. And then I have one more statistical question. Given you rely on a regression analysis, did you explore the use of a matching technique?
We also did matching, finding exactly the same association. Well, not exactly the same, but comparable. So it doesn't seem to be distorted by the fact that we are comparing a big sample with a small sample.
Okay, great. So I'm not seeing any other questions, and we are getting close to the end of our time. So let me thank you, Jan, for a fascinating talk. And I will look forward to seeing the results when you can get access to good Australian data to continue this work, as well as your continued work with the Dutch data. So thank you. And for those of you, thank you for joining us. And I very much would like to thank you for being a part of the audience. And I hope that you have enjoyed this colloquium and that I will look forward to seeing you at our July colloquium when my colleague, Professor Yuting Zhang, will be discussing issues related to private health insurance. At the bottom of your function, you will see a link that will allow you to register for the colloquium. Plus, I'm sure we will send you a reminder of the dates and registrations for the colloquium. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in July.